Oh, hi there. Welcome to this episode of the Big Sis Business Podcast, where today we're talking about feedback. I once received feedback from a boss that her 5-year-old could have written better email copy than I had. That feedback literally resulted in me balled up on my couch, crying. That's how the word feedback makes me feel. Like crying. You'll hear my own anxiety throughout this session with Melissa Lampson, founder of Lead with DEI. I call it a session because Melissa has a way of framing things for me that I feel like I should definitely be paying for. Her open-hearted approach to practical problems in life and work always leave me inspired to show up and be my very best self. That's why these major brands like LinkedIn, SpaceX, and Twitter trust her to make their managers suck less, aka all-star communicators and leaders. I can't wait for you to hear from her, and I hope that you'll learn a little bit about your own relationship with feedback throughout her session, and maybe even take the leap to welcome it into your life. All right, Melissa, hello. I am just really amped to have you on because you are a huge deal and you have so much experience. Please just tout your credentials. Tell the children, Melissa, who are you? What do you do?
Well, thank you for having me, Andrea. It's a pleasure. Okay, my credentials. So I've had over 20 years of leadership and management consulting experience, and I work with all kinds of great companies. I specialize in those that are in hyper growth mode to help create great leaders and great people managers so that they can be really successful, retain great talent, key, right? And be really successful as an organization. So.
And these are guys like LinkedIn and like Twitter and like everyone that anyone's ever heard of, right?
Yeah, my leadership programs at all those SpaceX and Coinbase and Zillow and lots of fun companies I've had the pleasure to work with. Yeah,
like companies that people want to work for with like leaders that they want to work with, right? Like this is the woman behind those people that you want to go work with. Like it's crazy. And so you're here because one, I adore you, of course. And obviously I think you have a wealth of knowledge. And three, with all of that experience, I felt like you were the perfect person to come and help people understand the benefit of not only receiving feedback, but also giving it. And you taught me how to do this way, way better. But before we get into like how to do that and all of the things, like what proof points do you share, right? Like feedback is hard. Why should we do this?
Why should we care about giving effective feedback?
Yeah. And receiving it, right? And like putting ourselves in the position of being judged and like accepting it and all of those things. Like it feels like maybe just avoidance is better.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good point. I think when people say feedback, they often think about it as being, something critical, right? Or, oh, wow, I'm about to be judged, to use your word. And I think what's important is if we can create a culture of feedback where we understand that it's also giving supportive feedback, right? Like, hey, I really love that presentation because you nailed those particular points. Or I thought you showed up in the meeting really well today. And I think it was really clear for the team, right? And how we're going to move forward. As well as, hey, you could consider doing this a bit differently in your presentation because it wasn't super clear. And now we're all kind of struggling with it, right? That's also perfectly good feedback. And I think if we just understand that it's not really about personal attacks, but how can we continue to be great at the things that we're great at and also improve in the areas that we may need to, then it becomes more neutralized, if you will.
And so we're talking about feedback kind of broadly to your point, right? The positive, negative, whatever. But you have a framework. Like you have a very specific, proven way to give and receive feedback in a way that is like productive and helpful and actually gets things done. So there will be a video component of this where we will show the feedback, which is a far easier way to understand it. But for podcast listeners, can you just walk through the feedback really quickly for us and like the different stage? You call them stages? Are they stages?
Yeah, you could say stages, absolutely, or steps. That's a good question. Like, what's the difference between a step and a stage? But phases, I don't know. I think steps were probably most appropriate for it. But the feedback framework is there's 6 steps, and they are. It sounds a bit cumbersome when I say that. Like, oh my gosh, 6 things. How do I remember them? But it actually becomes pretty easy once you get the flow of it. So the first one is really intention. So if you think about when you get feedback from someone, if you are clear what the intention is, there's a better chance that you're going to receive it well. So why am I receiving this feedback, or why am I actually giving this feedback to someone else? If you're making that clear. And then, of course, tying that intention to something that's motivating for them. So if someone's looking to improve in a particular area and you know that, then you can emphasize that, right? Hey, I know you were really looking to become a better meeting facilitator. I just want to give you some feedback that might help, right? Improve that. And so then the person goes, oh yeah, I'm really open to that because that ties to one of my goals, one of my motivations. So intention, and then observation, which is really key. So this is where it's not, hey, I think, I feel, I heard. It's really, this is what happened factually. And then you move on to impact. And what's the impact of what I've observed, right? Or what the person who's giving the feedback has observed. And so that's really key. I think that's important, because to mention here is, sometimes we're in the position of giving third-party feedback. And I don't necessarily think that's always a bad thing. I mean, of course, if we hear something from a customer and we're a person's manager, we need to deliver feedback. That's a situation where we do need to kind of give third-party feedback. But as much as we can have the person own the feedback to deliver that directly to the person who needs the feedback, the better, right? Because then it's much more authentic. It's much clearer. It helps actually maintain and build the trust and relationship between those individuals involved in it. And there's less risk involved. So anyway, intention, observation, which are facts, and then the impact of what happened. And then the impact is important not to forget, because that essentially shares with you what the outcome was. So what visibly was happening, what were some of the tactical outcomes because of what you observed. And then you move on to discuss. So you've shared your intention, you've shared the observation, you've shared the impact. And if you've done that well, if you open it up to have some kind of discussion with the person, like, hey, so what are your thoughts? That's what I saw. That's what I observed. That's the impact it had on me. And I'd love to hear what you think. Then typically someone will go, wow, this person's really doing me a favor. I see the intention. I see, gosh, I kind of see what just happened. And I could understand that could be the impact, even if I didn't notice it in the moment. And they may, at that point, start to suggest solutions. If they're still a little bit lost, then it's up to you to kind of lean in there and say, well, here's what I'd like to see happen next. And we call that section focus. So you have a bit of a discussion, and then you have focus, and focus is the suggestion for improvement or the suggestion to keep going if it's a positive feedback flow. And then an agreement, or agree, is the 6th stage, to say, let's talk again to make sure that what you've tried out is working for you, or let's check in again and see if that's improved, or if you continuing to do that is getting you great results, right? So the last pieces are discuss, focus, and then agree.
And what's the hardest?
Yeah, I think impact is one of the trickier ones, from what I've heard from the groups that I worked with, because sometimes it's hard to know exactly what that is. So let's say someone's talking a lot in a meeting, then you might see the group start to check out, get on their phones, get on their laptops, just look bored. That's all a little bit difficult to describe an impact, but people know what that is, because we've all sat in meetings where people are checking out and where we've checked out, right? So, and that's something visual that you can really point to factually, but it's sometimes hard to pick that out.
to your point, 6 steps does seem like tedious, right? So like, do you suggest that people prep before they give feedback? And if so, like, how much time do you sort of like think about these things? Because that was a big thing for me. I feel like anytime that I don't prep for feedback, it totally sucks, right? And so like, I absolutely think that using the framework and prepping, especially actually the intent part, is typically what I've missed, is like just setting the stage of why I'm sharing this feedback and having to even check myself to be like, am I just annoyed at this person? Like, I think I might just be annoyed and my intention is not actually in their best interest. So like, I have to check myself to be like, this feedback is maybe not even very good. Like, so that's my biggest thing, is like, I actually feel like I'm good at impact, but my intention has not always historically been amazing. But like, what do you think? Like, people should be prepping for this, right? Like, willy-nilly feedback, or like, what do you do in the heat of the moment? Is there a place and time for it?
Yeah, you just mentioned a lot of really good points. So I think part of the preparation in terms of feedback, I mean, if it's really a feedback conversation that you need to have with someone, if it's heated, right, or if you're annoyed, or if they just really blew it and it hurt something, project wise or customer wise, then of course that's when you want to take just a moment, right? Let me cool down a moment, see where I can kind of approach this in a productive way so that it's helpful, so that I don't upset them, demotivate them, and also so that I'm not, sort of harming my brand as a leader or manager or team member here. And so it's good to take that moment, but it's also good not to wait too long. So sometimes we just go, well, I'm really upset, so I'm going to stuff it away. And then 3 months later, either it blows up in another situation, or we just go, well, do you remember 3 months ago, I was really upset about this? And they won't have any reference points. It's really hard to share with them observations and impact when they don't necessarily even remember what happened, or maybe never knew what happened in the first place. So timing is really important. Obviously, atmosphere and your own level of heatedness is important. And then you also mentioned a good point that in terms of intention, yeah, I mean, I think it's okay to even say something like, this morning I was really frustrated because we've been working so hard on this. And I really thought, that we were going to nail it. I mean, I think it's okay to own frustration and even anger. And that people, and also to make that normal, that people can handle that, right? So we should have productive conflict. We should be able to share emotions with each other and come and work through that. Right. And let that person say, look, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to let you down, so that you can kind of continue to build trust and be really honest with each other. So I think it can be a both and.
This is why I love you so much, because every time I feel like I'm an asshole, you're like, sometimes like it's okay. It's okay to be a human being and mess up and have emotions. And you just phrase things and turn things in such a positive way. I love it. And I want to start with this segment is all about kind of the differences in who we are as human beings and the impact of that on our ability to give and receive feedback. So you do a ton of work with women. I know you put on workshops for women. I know you do a ton of work with generational differences. So you have programs for women over 50 and all of these great things. So let's start with generational differences. So what, they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? So if you are a person under 30 and your manager is over 50, like, what do you think people need to understand about kind of how old they are, for lack of a smarter way to say it, impacts how they give and receive feedback?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's interesting. So there's a couple different schools of thought on this, Andrea. One is that the generational differences aren't quite as different as we thought they were. So there are some studies coming out saying it's more around personality differences, upbringing, environmental conditioning, right, culture, that has a bigger impact on the way people give and receive feedback and how they're comfortable with feedback. And then there is also the other piece where it says, yeah, there are some trends across the different generations. So for example, boomers may be more apt to consider feedback be constructive criticism, right? And that you give feedback when you need to improve something, not necessarily when you want to just celebrate something or tell someone they did a good job. Where in the, I think really the millennial area, and I'm not so sure about Gen Z, I'd have to pay a little bit more attention to that, or Gen Y, where are we now? Like whatever the latest generation entering the workforce in now. Obviously I need to pay a little more attention to that, but the millennials, just because I know with my stepson who's 27, they everything was celebrated for him. So like everyone got an award in his senior year for academic excellence with letters signed by President Obama at the time saying, what fabulous kids you are.
You graduate kindergarten now. You graduate kindergarten.
So I'm assuming it's kind of continuing, right? And so I see a lot of, I guess that's true. I see with my nephews because they're the younger generation going into high school, and there's just a lot of celebration and support and great jobs and so forth. So it's a lot of positive feedback, and that there might be a difference that we didn't get so much of that. Boomers and then even Gen Xers, I think we're somewhere in between, but probably less on the positive side and more on when something needed to be improved. But in general, I think culture and personality outweighs it a bit more.
Got it. Good to know. And what about gender?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I think it's style. There may be some different styles. So the interesting thing about the feedback framework, which we just talked about, is that the components are the same, or the steps are the same, but knowing who the person is and where they sort of orient is important in terms of how many words you use or what kind of language you're using, right? So it might be that if someone's more feelings oriented, and sometimes people say that, as women, we're conditioned to be a little bit more oriented towards feelings, that we would, or feelings first, I should say, that we'll consider, and let me emphasize that a little more or explain that a bit more. What I mean by feelings first is not that we're emotional, more emotional than men, but that we'll think about how is the community, how is this resonating with the community? How is the team and the customer and this meeting, and what about the harmony of this particular situation? And if we do this with the project, what impact will it have on people? That as women, we tend to think about that first. And then later we go into much more of kind of a tactical mode where we might start focusing on facts and figures and numbers and so forth. Where men tend to do it sort of oppositely. They'll think about what are those facts and figures and numbers, and then, oh yeah, by the way, we should probably consider, what the impact is on people involved. And those are very big generalizations, I know, but those are some of the tendencies in terms of masculine and feminine energy, which both men and women hold, right? But that's all a conversation for maybe another podcast. But because of that, we do consider potentially people's feelings, particularly when we're talking to other women. So if I'm giving you feedback, Andrea, I might be just sort of a little softer, a little more, hey, I adore you and it's really great. And you knocked it out of the park with these other three things you did. But this one, if you'd mind, I'd love to give you some feedback around that. If you'd like to hear what I have to say, I might be more gentle, where if I went to someone else who's got more stronger masculine energy, I might say something like, hey, that was really terrible and you really need to consider improving it next time. And they would actually appreciate that because of the directness, right? And the clarity with which I'm saying that. Now, actually, because I know you probably appreciate for me to tell you that something was terrible more directly than sugarcoating it. But it depends obviously on the personality too. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, knowing the gender differences or tendencies and knowing some of the generational differences, that's all fine and interesting. But most importantly, really consider that person individually and think about, how do they speak to me? What's the language they're using? How do they write? How do they give feedback to others? How are they showing up in meetings? And then you can kind of orient your language to kind of match theirs so that it doesn't become a complete disconnect, right? And the other way to do that too is if that's too difficult, which sometimes it is, is to say, look, I'm a really direct person and I just really want to tell you something directly. And I hope that please know that I have utmost respect for you as a team member. That might be one way of doing it. Or, hey, I'm really uncomfortable with direct feedback and direct conversation. So I'm going to flower this up a bit, but try to follow me, so you can do that too. But as much as you can lean into the way that person communicates, the better the outcome will be.
Totally agree. That was some of the advice that you gave to me when I was starting to get more comfortable giving feedback to someone in my life who shall remain nameless, who I never really was very good at giving feedback to. And that's because it was my boss. So like, if you have a boss who is not giving you the opportunity to give them a lot of feedback, right? Like some bosses are great at that. They'll be like, do you have any feedback for me? Like, what can I be doing better? Some bosses will never ask you that. And it can feel awkward to be like, hey, I've got some thoughts on what can be better here. What advice do you have for kind of approaching that, especially if you have, a boss that you're uncomfortable with? To your point that you're like starting a conversation about, this might be a little flowery or I'm very direct. Like if you're not a very direct person, how can you get comfortable giving feedback to someone who maybe has a more seemingly aggressive personality?
Yeah. I mean, you handled that so beautifully. I know the situation you're referring to. And I think, it always helps to have a catalyst. So in the case with that situation, we had just come out of doing a lot of management training and some coaching and so forth. And so it was like, oh, okay, this is a framework. Now, what do we do with it that we've all just learned? And so if there's a podcast that the company's listening to, or a book club where people are reading a book, or if you and your manager are sitting in some kind of a meeting where someone presents something about a particular topic, such as feedback, it's an opportunity in your next one-on-one or create a meeting if you're not having regular one-on-ones, which you should be, but if you're not, to go and sit down with them and say, hey, I thought that was so interesting. Could we try that? Could we test that out? Could we pilot giving each other feedback or using this framework or using this methodology that we just learned about in the organization? And so I think have it be mutual, right? So of course you want to share your feedback with them, but you also would like to hear it from them. And if they're open to it, that's great. And I think in your case they were, so that's really positive. But it is always a little intimidating, right? When you have someone who's, of course, has a certain amount of power over your job or over your situation or in the company or in an organization. And then also if they have a particular personality that's really assertive or aggressive, and that's not necessarily one's own style. So it's just, just do it, kind of break through it, find a way through and have that conversation, because it can be really, I think 9 times out of 10 leaders want to have those conversations and they see value in it. And actually, I would say, what's even positive is some of the more assertive leaders tend to be more interested in hearing more direct feedback. That is the way they like to give it. And so they also tend to like to hear it that way as well.
I love that advice. Because I think too, if you think about your boss, right? Like your feedback will help them get better, right? Feedback is a gift is this like statement that kind of sounds cheesy, but it's true that they probably, because of that personality, don't get feedback very often either. And they actually do, I experience the same thing, very much want to hear it because they're typically very high achieving individuals and want to do better.
Yeah, that's right.
So speaking of, people that you're uncomfortable giving feedback, I'm going to be totally honest, right? Like I do not have a super diverse background in terms of race and different cultures. And so I'll be completely frank, it makes me very nervous to give feedback to people from different backgrounds. And I know you do a ton of work with diversity and inclusion. So talk to me a little bit about, thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, especially when we're having conversations that are about belonging, psychological safety, inclusion, racism, sexism. Those are all really tough conversations to have. And I think it's really important to dial into empathy as much as we can, right? And to say, look, how we really feel. So to express, I'm really uncomfortable. I don't know how to give feedback, but there's something that, that's come up for me that I'd really like to share with you, because my intention is for us to build a closer relationship, for us to have more trust between us. And I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly. I don't know if this is going to come out right. And I certainly don't, the last thing I want to do is hurt you. But I also feel like it's important that we have the conversation so that we just don't walk around each other without taking an opportunity to get closer potentially. And I want you to feel like you can really come to me and say that isn't the right way to phrase it, or that kind of hurts my feelings the way you phrase it, or whatever it is that needs to be said, and that we'll listen to that. But I think the more we have conversations, I know that the more we have conversations, because whenever I'm facilitating these kind of conversations, it's so simple, but it's so beautiful because people are just connecting as humans. And that's where we can make all the difference, because we make up so much stuff in our heads, right? About what's going on and what people's experiences are. And I think if we also acknowledge, right? I just had lunch with someone the other day and I just said, look, I acknowledge that this is just really tough. Like, how do you as a Black woman establish credibility in this world of white men, older white men who are just kind of like running the show? We were talking about a particular industry, and like, that must be so challenging. How do you deal with that? Right. And just kind of leaning into those conversations with true curiosity, but also with some understanding. I mean, it's not like we can't go to the internet or read a book and truly understand the experience of others. Let's say not truly understand, but get some understanding of the experience of others, and therefore some empathy, so that we can come into these conversations more knowledgeable instead of completely clueless. Right. And then therefore uncomfortable. So,
Melissa's made it sound so easy. Right? You just are an open-hearted, lovely human being who uses this framework. But and you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, right? That a lot of people, when they get do you say the words negative feedback, or you say constructive feedback? What do you say?
I usually say constructive. Yeah. Yeah, I usually say constructive. Yeah.
Okay. So we all have those people in our lives, right? That when they receive constructive feedback, they immediately fire back with, well, you're no better, blah, 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 right? Or people who just in general, say like, I don't get it. I don't think that's accurate. I don't see it. That's not what happened in the meeting, right? Like, so to your point, you are positioning your feedback from an observational perspective and fact-based, but some people rewrite facts in their head to protect themselves. And so what do you do when you meet this person and you are so careful and considerate and open-hearted about your feedback, and they just shut that shit down? What do you do?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a couple different things. I mean, I think as a people manager, if this is one of the people in your team that you're responsible for, you can take a little bit more of an authoritative voice there and say, look, I hear you. I understand we have different perspectives on this, but I really need you to do X, and be really explicit about it. Typically, those who are shutting down feedback, it's usually those who may not have as much self-awareness about their own behavior, right? And their own what they're doing. And so and sometimes that's also because they haven't had as much maybe work experience or as much team experience or as experience with customers, but there's a lot of confidence there, which is great, because you can leverage that obviously for the betterment of the team and the work with the clients. But if they're resistant, I think you may have to lean in a bit on and be a little more authoritative. Look, I understand, but I'd really like you to try it this way, because this is where we found success. Another way to do it is to kind of just sit back and say, yeah, okay, well, I hear you. Why don't you just share with me your perspective? And you listen, do a lot of listening. And sometimes you'll get them to sort of spiral around to kind of go, you know what, I see your point. And all you're doing is just being quiet and listening. And they may come to their own conclusion, which is the conclusion you'd like them to come to, or at least the conclusion that maybe they don't know it all and, hey, they'd love some support from you. And you can keep reemphasizing that and say, look, I'm here to support you, as your team member, as your colleague, as your friend, as your partner, I really do want what's best for you. And if you keep kind of saying that, they may talk their defensiveness down, right, for themselves. And then I think I'm thinking if there's a third way to do it. I think those are two really good ways.
That'll do. Yeah, that'll do. And so you kind of mentioned self-awareness, which is a topic that I am, I know this is about feedback, but I'm kind of just curious your take on this. Like, can people get better at self-awareness? Are you just born, self-judgmental? Is this a personality trait? Where does self-awareness come from? And is there, I guess, a way to identify someone who's like not very self-aware and a way to like pivot your feedback maybe based on it?
I think that's where creating that regular cadence of feedback is very important to say, this is something that's kind of new. We haven't tried this out before. We know that it's really effective in most companies and teams, and there's lots of people teaching feedback out there. I mean, just sort of showing kind of the numbers and benchmarks around what's the importance of feedback, and say, but you and I haven't tried it, or this team hasn't tried it, this organization hasn't. Let's try it. And if we make a regular practice of it, it'll help all of us to be more aware of, where can we improve and where can we continue to be great.
I've had people sort of frame feedback in a coaching way, meaning that they don't actually say what their observation is. They kind of position it like, well, what do you think you could have done better during that presentation, in a way that feels like they're testing you, right? Like, I don't know, if I thought I could have done something differently, I probably would have, right? Like I kind of need you to tell me what are your thoughts on the subject? Do you have how do you kind of receive feedback that's like that? That's kind of like a quiz for you that you didn't ask to take.
Yeah. That's right. Well, it feels a little manipulative, right? When someone says like, well, how did you think it went? Right. And especially if they're responsible for your career in some way, it's also additionally weirder because it's like, oh, well, I guess it went badly. I don't know. Did it go well? I mean, I think, so I guess is the question, should we be doing that? I would say definitely not. I think that's where the discuss phase is so important in this feedback framework, right? Is, hey, I'd like to give you some feedback. My intention of giving you this feedback is this. What I've observed is that the impact was this. What are your thoughts though? I'm open to hearing your side of the story, right? What do you think? How was it for you? That's where that question comes in. So you're very clear about what your side is, but you're also open to hearing what they think. They might say, oh yeah, you're right. I just drank so much coffee today and I didn't mean to talk so much in that meeting, or I'm off because I was up all night with my dog. So I stumbled over my words a bit and I couldn't get it quite right, or whatever it is. And then that's where there's some vulnerability sharing and some openness to being able to then move forward to find a solution. And as I said, the best case scenario is if they can go, okay, all right, next time I'll tone it down on the coffee before the meetings, right? Or whatever the solution is. Obviously, there might be more complexity to the solutions, but that certainly can be one of them.
And I love that you're talking about solutions, because one of the things that I've struggled with is everyone's got an opinion, right? There's a statement. Opinions are like assholes. Everyone's got one, right? And so as you're trying to decide what to do, and I've had this in my own life and experience, right? Like a lot of people have told me to swear less, right? And they have, they have good arguments for why, right? Like their impact is like, well, it could, come off as less professional, blah, 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 right? Like they have an impact, and then we discuss it. I provide my perspective on it. And sort of in the agreement phase, I'm like, I'm not changing. Right? Like I is sort of what I've decided. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do people, because I've struggled with that throughout my career, right? Feedback from people who, I mean, it seems like good feedback that's well-intentioned, but maybe it's just not right for me. Like, how do I know when to kind of tell feedback to go fuck itself?
So I don't know if I can give you a really clear yes or no answer or clear solution for that per se. But I think because it's an age old question: is how much do I adapt? How much do I change, for another person? What's important for me about style switching? I mean, what we know is that style switching can help us get closer to others. Matching someone's personality style can be useful because it brings them closer to us, and then we can be more authentic with them. So I think I'm always an advocate of, let's try to meet each other sort of in the middle. So if I might have an advantage because I get a sense of your personality. So I'll kind of up my level of directness. Maybe I'll add a few swear words. Maybe I'll be more, I'll use some sort of silly humor because I know that might be someone's personality, right? And so I'll lean into that a bit more. And then that person should hopefully feel more comfortable with me. And then in the times when they see that I'm not swearing on a regular basis, or I'm not being very funny, they go, oh, okay, well, she really kind of seems to like this more serious approach with maybe less swear words. And so maybe I'll move towards her a bit, right, in this particular setting. And so I think it's just about, making that adjustment. But I think we all do need to own our own brand. And, for you, I know that, swearing once in a while and, throwing in some funny humor once in a while is absolutely your brand. And I think people really appreciate it. But I also know that you can style switch, right? So if you're in, I don't know, if you go to church or if you go to, if you're ever in a religious situation or a situation with grandparents who don't really love swearing or people that don't, you can style switch out of that, right? But you're not necessarily leaving, you're not being an Andrea, you're just not necessarily dropping an F-bomb in those situations. And so I think it's just kind of knowing when we need to modify, but also not losing our authentic selves.
And a funny story, actually, about why I swear so much. So I am the granddaughter of a sailor and the daughter of a sailor. So I wear that with great pride. But then also, when I was in kindergarten, I said shit. And my teacher was like, you can't say that. And I was like, no, I definitely can. My grandma says shit. Like, I know I can't say fuck because my grandma does not say fuck, but she says shit. So I'm pretty sure that that's a kosher word because if my grandma says it, then it must be okay. All right. So this is my last question before I let you go. What have I not asked you? What is like the big thing that as you're in companies teaching these strategies to managers and all of the things, what do people commonly ask, or what are they struggling with that we didn't get to? Give me some feedback.
Yeah. Well, you know what I'm going to say. No, you're always extremely thorough. And I think we covered everything. But the difference between coaching and feedback, you kind of slipped it in there, but I think it's important. Yeah, no, you did. You mentioned it. I think it's important for people to understand that when you're coaching someone, that's really, that they really own the outcome, the person you're coaching. And when you're giving feedback to someone, it's really what you would like to see the outcome be. And so I really like to make that distinction because I think we need more managers and leaders to become great coaches, which means that they're really empowering their employees to find their own solutions. And so I know that's kind of a bit of a cliffhanger, but maybe we can talk about coaching in another podcast. But I think it's good to really start to distinguish that.
Yeah, I love that. And to your point, you tie so nicely into all of the next questions or comments that I have, which my next one is that if someone is listening to this and they're like, oof, I feel like we need some managerial training, tell the people where to find you, Melissa. You will help. And you are amazing.
Yes, I would love to help.
I speak from experience. So where do they find you?
Thank you. So leadwithdei.com, leadwithdei.com. You can find me, Melissa, at leadwithdei.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Melissa Lamson, Lamson, which is primarily where I'll interact, but I'm also on Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of your time. This was great.
My pleasure.
I'm sure we can dive into way more topics later. Thanks again.
Thank you, Andrea.